Hey YouTube, today I'm going to walk you through any particular foods that you might want to avoid when it comes to trying to drop body fat. If you search the internet looking for fat loss advice on diet, nutrition and food intake, you'll no doubt come across some people who are going to suggest certain foods or food groups that you should avoid or completely eliminate. In this video, I'm going to give you the honest truth as to whether or not you need to eliminate or avoid foods, and if so, what particular foods you might want to start thinking about potentially avoiding or just eating more in moderation. So by the end of this video, you're going to be confident in what you're taking in through food is going to be absolutely fine for your fat loss efforts. If you do enjoy this video, please do drop a like. If you have any questions throughout, throw them down below. If you haven't already, please do go ahead and subscribe. So before we get into any particular foods that you might want to avoid or eliminate, we're going to walk through some food factors, or let's say properties, that are going to determine whether or not you might want to include in your diet, how much of that you might want to include in your diet, and again, if you might need to eliminate or avoid it. First and foremost, we have calorie content. So very simply put, how many calories are in that food item. Now obviously you probably want to compare this, let's say, per weight, if you're comparing it to other foods, to identify how calorie dense that item is. So for example, you could compare it per 100 grams. Okay, and you can have a look at two food groups, or food items, should I say, and you can have a look at which food item is more calorie dense than the other. Now, the reason why this property of a food is going to be important to consider is because very simply, you need to manage the amount of calories total that you're taking in each day and across the week if you're looking for a fat loss result, because you need to make sure you're remaining in a calorie deficit over time, taking in less food than you are expending. Therefore, if foods are very calorie dense, it might not be the smartest idea to include a lot of those foods within our diet. However, does this mean you have to eliminate or avoid all calorie dense foods? No. Obviously, we can still include some in moderation and still likely keep our calories as a whole, as a total across the day, across the week, moderated and remain in a calorie deficit. But it's something to consider, how calorie dense is that food item. The second property we want to consider, which links to calorie content, how calorie dense it is the volume of that food. The volume of that food being essentially how much that food takes up in a space. So let's say on your plate, how much of the space on your plate does that food take up for the given amount of calories? So again, let's take the example of comparing two foods at 100 grams. And let's say for the 100 grams, they're the same calorie content. So they contain 100 calories to keep it simple. But one food item takes up a quarter of your plate for the 100 grams for the 100 calories. The second item takes up half your plate for the 100 grams of the 100 calories. And let's say for the example given here, they're both solid food items, okay, not liquids. The second item that takes up half that plate is going to be higher in volume, okay? Now, why this property matters is because volume is going to be very important and very useful for hunger management. If a food item is higher in volume, that is going to go a lot further to filling you up, keeping you feeling full, satiated, and not having, let's say, potential issues or as much potential issues with hunger, which when we're in a calorie deficit, hunger is something that we're going to have to be prepared to experience and to be prepared to manage. So, when you're trying to achieve fat loss, would it be smart to maybe try and make sure a lot of our diet is full of high volume foods? Probably. Might be a good idea. And when we're comparing these two things, if we can find foods that are high in volume and relatively low in calories, that is a win-win when it comes to hunger management. On the flip side, if we're finding foods that are low volume, so don't take up a lot of space, aren't going to do a good job at managing hunger, but are calorie dense at the same time, and therefore going to eat into a lot of our calorie allowance, those might be foods that we want to potentially avoid, or at least make sure we're having in moderation, because it's probably not going to favor our goal. Thirdly, nutrients. Okay, every food item is going to have a certain level of nutrients within it. Some food items are going to be more nutritious than others, and this is the way, in my opinion, that we should be viewing food rather than labeling food as healthy versus unhealthy or good versus bad. When you look at people that label food as good versus bad or healthy versus unhealthy, typically under the good and healthy categories, the foods are more nutritious. Okay, the property is they have more nutrients within them, whereas the foods that people are categorizing as unhealthy or bad are foods that are less nutritious. They have less nutrients within them. Now, it's not that those foods are necessarily bad or worse or are going to do, let's say, damage. But it is to say that those foods might be less favorable, one, for your goal, and two, yes, for your overall health. But it still is not a smart way, in my opinion, to categorize them as bad. So, very simply put, when your goal is fat loss, when your goal is general health, yes, it's probably going to be a better idea to make sure that the majority of our diet is containing foods that are very nutritious. And then the foods that are less nutritious, we're potentially moderating, maybe not completely eliminating, but we'll get onto that in a minute. What you also might find typically is that foods that are less nutritious can very often also be low in volume and high in calories. Whereas on the other hand, foods that are very nutritious can often typically be high in volume and low in calories. And all of a sudden, we're getting a picture of certain food groups that we might want to include more of, and vice versa, some food groups that we want to include less of. And then number 4, the last point, which is still a very, very important one, and one that a lot of people actually forget when it comes to foods that they are considering that they need to remove, eliminate. And that is enjoyment, okay? Not necessarily a property of a food, but your emotions and feelings towards that food. What are the foods you enjoy? Now, the reason this is important is because for a goal, for a fat loss goal to be successful, for us to be successful with our fat loss goal, for us to find a diet or nutrition or just food intake that are going to help us get to our goal, we have to enjoy it because it has to be consistent. If we hate what we're eating, we're not going to be consistent in doing it. So we have to enjoy it on some level, which means we're then going to want to include some of the foods that we do enjoy. Now, if some of the foods that we do enjoy are going to come into this category of less nutritious, lower in volume, higher in calories, then yes, we want to be smart. We might have to understand and realize that some of these foods are going to have to be, let's say, restricted a little bit, let's say, eaten in moderation. But the complete avoidance and elimination of these foods can often just result in people not enjoying their nutrition and actually end up binging, because they've restricted themselves so much that when they eventually let into that craving, they just go crazy. Often you'll hear the word trigger food and stuff like that. Trigger foods being foods that once you have some, you struggle to stop, right? Now, they might be foods that you enjoy, but just as an example, if you can manage those well, where you can, start to learn to indulge in some, but not too much, you can still enjoy these sort of foods. Whereas if you really just try and restrict and avoid trigger foods, often or not, eventually you're going to give in, you're going to have some. And if you do that with a trigger food, then it is very likely that you're going to overconsume and really go all out. And if we just avoid and restrict these foods that we enjoy, over time, it's not going to lead to a great relationship with food. And that can just mean our fat loss goal can actually do more damage than good for our long-term relationship with food. So, are there foods that you completely need to avoid and eliminate for your fat loss? No. Are there foods that are going to stop you directly from dropping body fat? No. Are there foods that hold different properties to other foods and therefore might be a better choice in having more within your diet? Yes. And vice versa, are there some foods that have other properties to other foods that might mean having them in moderation and potentially restricting them a little bit might be beneficial for our fat loss goal? Yes. But is it important to include foods that we enjoy so that we can be consistent and that we are still working towards a healthy relationship towards food as a whole? Yes. A good rule of thumb is the 70-30 idea, or you maybe heard some people say 80-20. Depends how restrictive you want to be. But the 70-30 idea is that 70% of your diet is going to come from what we've spoken about of the more nutritious food, higher volume, less calorie dense items when we're looking at fat loss. And then that 30% is going to come from foods that are potentially less nutritious, lower in volume, and higher in calories. And the way we're controlling to 30%, we're having that in moderation to allow us to still stick to our calories and do what needs to be done to get the results that we're after. But this little principle or idea also then allows us to keep a good amount of enjoyment within our diet. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please do drop a like. If you have any questions by the end of this, then throw them down below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe because it helps me out a lot. And I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.